Hi, I'm Enguerrand Los. I'm the founder of CaseCoach. I'm a former interviewer with McKinsey. In this video, I will be interviewed by Rob, another McKinsey alumnus. We'll be going through a fit interview similar to what you'll experience at Bain, BCG, or at many other top employers. Rob will interrupt me from time to time to share his feedback. Let's get started.
Thanks for coming down.
Thank you.
How was your trip down here? Did you have a long way to travel or quite close?
No, I just live Upper Manhattan.
All right, perfect. So look, we're going to cover a case, but before we get onto that, I wanted to just talk a bit about your background and your career aspirations as well. Could we start with you just telling me a bit more about yourself and giving me a quick overview of your background?
Yeah, sounds good. Do you want my seat?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So basically, I'm a computer engineer by training, but at the moment I'm a first-year MBA student at Columbia Business School. I have 6 years work experience, first 2 years as an entrepreneur in technology, and the last 4 years prior to business school in venture capital, all of this in Paris.
Right.
So really, if you see the thread, I'm someone with a strong interest in technology. That's why I studied computer engineering, but also a passion for business, and that's what led me to start my own companies and then be at business school and in venture capital.
So there are a few things which work particularly well in this opening. First, the candidate does a great job of not just describing what he's done, but what kind of person he is. He mentions that he's got an interest in business and also in technology, and these comments provide a platform for much of the conversation that follows. Second, he's thoughtful in selecting topics to mention. He flags that he was an entrepreneur. He talks about his journey into the MBA, and these provide talking points that give an opportunity for the interviewer to ask more, to probe and to jump in and learn more about the candidate himself. Lastly, it's concise. You'll notice he's done all of this in less than 30 seconds. While it's tempting to spend a long time describing your initial background, it's better to give a quick view and then let it become a conversation. Interesting, and I can see, I think from your first company, it looks like you started that while you were at university.
Yeah,
how did you go about that? It must have been quite a challenge.
Yes, absolutely. That was interesting. Let's say I didn't go to many classes that year, but I managed to do well and graduate with distinction. I actually enrolled a few of my classmates to start up the initial tech team of the startup, and we managed to deliver a full e-commerce website within 2 months, which at the time, with the technologies available, was very short.
Right, interesting. And then I see, obviously, you've continued in the technology sector. Could you tell me a bit more about your time in venture capital?
Yeah, so the story was, I started my own business, and I realized at 22-year-old that I had a lot to learn about running a business. Initially I said, okay, well, when we sold it, I'm going to go to a much more established tech firm. So I joined Viafone, which was a Silicon Valley funded startup. I was the only employee in Europe that seasoned executive. So it was a great opportunity for me to learn from a more established firm. And as I was doing that, I was in touch with our venture capitalist. And I realized that another way to really learn about business was to become a venture capitalist, because you get to meet many entrepreneurs, learn about many different business models. I joined Peak Capital, spent 4 years there. On top of working on investment, like any other venture capital associate, I ended up leading fundraising for our firm, which was very challenging at the time because of the economic crisis.
Right, so this was after the dot-com bubble burst, as it were.
Absolutely, and later on, our funds had lost like 40% on average, and I was like knocking on the doors of potential investors to get more money, and it worked. So it was a great experience.
You'll notice in the section you just saw that the candidate did an excellent job of suggesting positive things about himself without seeming boastful or arrogant in any way. He does this simply by stating the facts and stating them almost in passing. He achieved a distinction in his course while he was running a business. He managed to raise funds for his venture capital firm, despite there being an economic crisis at the time. But he states them in a fairly passing way, and it works very effectively. He also continues the arc of his career. He mentions his growing interest in business, how this led to VC, and you'll notice in the next section how this leads to his career decisions now. Wonderful. Good. And what is it that draws you to consulting at this stage in your career? Because, I mean, you've had a lot of interesting experiences so far. I'm curious where consulting plays a role.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, as you can tell, I'm really interested in businesses, right? And I started mine, then went to another one to learn more about business. And I've now spent 6 years on small businesses. And I really want to learn how bigger business operate. I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs do really well when they're 10, 20, 30 employees. I don't have the experience of seeing what happens when you have 10,000, 50,000, 100,000. So I think consulting would be the perfect place to learn about all this. And particularly, I think in McKinsey in Boston, because you have as far as I understand, quite a strong portfolio of tech clients, which is a sector that I'm really passionate about.
Notice what the candidate has done here. In actual fact, his career transition might not seem entirely natural. Going from entrepreneurship and technology and venture capital to management consulting is not a classic career path. However, because of the setup of the interview earlier on, where the candidate's described his growing interest in business and how this motivates him and how he's seen this at a certain scale but wants to see it at a larger scale, the transition actually comes across as very natural. Notice also how he's done his research. He mentions something specific about the firm and even the office that he's interviewing with. This makes his response about his interest in the firm much more credible.
Yeah, absolutely. We do work in the space, and I think it would be a natural fit from that perspective. Good. Okay. I've got a couple of questions about specific experiences in your career and maybe outside of it as well. So obviously, with the work that we do, we often have to work with clients over whom we don't have formal control, but with whom we have to make an impact.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if there's a time in your career or from outside your career where you've managed to influence someone, to persuade them to change their mindset or their behavior when you were not in a position of authority over them.
Sure. I guess a good example was when I was raising funds.
When you were knocking on the doors for all these people.
Absolutely. So as I said, we had raised about 100 million euros, and the performance was pretty bad. So I was looking for, and that was not necessarily our fault. The timing of our fundraising was really bad. So we had to, like every other investors, take a pretty important losses. But anyway, I identified a potential investor that my boss didn't really think we could convince. We didn't have any relationship with that company and that person. Right. I managed to first, get a foot through the door, and then through a fairly long process, convince them to give us 40 million euros to invest, which for the firm was a big deal, because at a time where it was really difficult to raise funds, it was amazing to be able to get 40 more million to manage, and over 8 years, that was really significant.
How did you go about managing to get to a position where you could do that? Because it sounds like you were coming into this quite cold. They weren't someone that the firm had a relationship with. How did you go about that?
Yeah, the first thing was to, I've identified a target through research, and I talked about it with the managing partner, my boss, and he said, don't spend your time on these people. I've worked with them in the past. It's not going to work out. And I realized there was some history there, but I was convinced there was something to do. Right. Because every year they were looking for a new fund manager, and I thought we were well equipped to do that job. So I went back and said, do you mind if I work on this on the side? Mm-hmm. And you say, sure, if it doesn't affect the rest of your work, I'm happy for you to do this. Right. So the first challenge was to get an appointment with the person, and after that, to manage to convince that person.
Okay. How did you get the appointment out of interest?
Well, I was trying to call the assistant. She didn't really want to book us, so I finally called after hours, basically managed to get through to the person directly. Right. He was really a bit annoyed that I was calling, and he said, well, if you want an appointment, you need to speak with my assistant. So there I could go back to the assistant and say, hey, he asked me to go to you to get the appointment, please book it.
Okay. Once you had your foot in the door, as it were, what were the major things you found effective in being able to convince this particular investor to get more involved?
Well, the first thing was to familiarize ourselves to each other. It was when we started the meeting, the first meeting, he was a bit upset. It was like, where are we meeting? I don't know you guys, etc. But I managed to kind of bring with me some example of investment that we had done with other investors that he knew. So, we were in the same deals sometimes. Right. So that was one. I spoke before with people who knew him. So I tried to understand how he was like, etc. And he was a very data-driven person. He's an accountant by training. So I brought quite a few numbers to show our work. After that first conversation, I was very young, so I brought the president of the firm to the meeting to have a bit of gray hair. That I think gave him a sense that, okay, we're a credible player. We know people that he knows and trusts. You know, at least we should be talking.
Right.
So I think that was the point where, okay, we were being considered, and he said, okay, fine, you know, when we open up this for bid, I'll invite you guys to make a proposal.
Interesting. And then by the sounds of it, it ended up working out. They got involved.
Well, yeah, absolutely. So it took a lot of work. Obviously, I kept sending them press clippings of our investments and gaining their trust. And I managed to arrange like an in-person meeting with him, like at the last minute between Christmas and New Year. So I got to meet him when he was alone at the office, and he talked a lot about what were their needs, what they were struggling with, what they were worried about. And I basically spent 2 months preparing a very detailed proposal, addressing every possible concerns, really showing that we had the strengths that he was looking for. It ended up being like a 60 pages document proposal that made sure that from his perspective, any question that he would be asked because he chose us, he had the answer.
Right.
And I know that the other firms that competed with us, they sent a 3-page letter.
Interesting.
Without the same type of facts. So basically after that, he invited us to meet the CEO of the bank. That's where for the first time my boss, the CEO, came, and after that meeting we got the deal.
Good stuff. Well, I guess persistence pays off.
Yes, in that case it does.
Yes.
Not always.
Not always.
Yeah.
Good.
This is a strong influence story, and there are a couple of things the candidate does particularly well. First, notice how he opens the story. He doesn't have a very long preamble. Instead, in a short space of time, he describes the headline of where he's going, that he managed to convince an investor his boss thought was a lost cause. This is a good characteristic in this part of the interview, and it tells the interviewer where you're going. You immediately signpost the arc of the story, and you can make it a conversation from there. Also, notice when we get into the details how effective his communication of the influence techniques is. First, there are a range of influence techniques he's describing. He influences the stakeholder partly by finding common points of interest, partly by providing details, backup, and data, partly also perhaps by the setting he's managed to interact with this individual in. But notice too how he describes what he knows about this individual. He's done his research, and he uses data and backup because he's understood that this individual is someone who themselves is very analytical and data-driven. This is a very effective technique. If you can root your influence techniques in something you know about that specific individual, it will come across as much more compelling.
Okay. Then another experience-based question as well. So I'm wondering, could you describe a time where you set an ambitious goal and describe how you went about achieving it?
Sure. Well, I guess we can come back to the company I started when I was a student.
Yeah, it'd be great to hear more about that.
The story was that I met those 2 entrepreneurs that had no technical background. And of course, I was a computer engineer student. And I was the president of the student consultancy in my school, which is the biggest in France. So I knew about web development and all those things. And they were in an interesting situation because they had investors to fund a new concept, which is a group buying website.
Right.
At the time it was new. So basically the more you buy, the more people buy, the lower the price of the product.
I see.
And the investor were like, okay, we're happy to fund you on the condition that you can have a running website within 2 months or 6 weeks, something like that.
Right.
So basically they came to me, they had contracted another firm, but there was no progress whatsoever. And that was my mission.
While you were studying, technically at least, and doing other things.
Yeah.
Right.
And we worked night and day. I brought all my friends from school. We worked on cardboard boxes. And what I did is that I sketched the website, what it should look like, every page, put them on the wall in the room of the apartment where we were working. And everybody had a color. Me and my other friends were all developing the website. And the idea was we would scratch one of the page with our color when we coded that page, and that was ready to go. Right. And that created a bit of a sense of competition, and also gave everybody a vision of the whole thing and of the progress. Right. And we made it, absolutely made it. We were the first to market. We had one page in the main French newspaper. We were on national TV that evening. So it was a real fun experience with my friends, which was really great. And we raised the money and we sold the business 9 months later with 35 people.
Fantastic. What were the major things you learned from that experience? I mean, it sounds like a lot of fun, and certainly you managed to get a lot of momentum.
Yeah.
through it.
So I think what's interesting is, if you look at what we were doing, we sold it, but really the business didn't make money, right? But we had a few categories of product that worked. We were selling tech products. For some reason, that worked really well.
Right.
Low margin, but worked really well. We were selling coupons. That worked really well as well. But 90% of our categories didn't work. We were selling jeans and lawn mowers and whatnot, right? And I think nobody really realized that there were a few things we were sitting on that had huge potential. Mm-hmm. The coupon business became Groupon.
Yes.
There were a number of websites that, like Newegg and others, that then started selling pure tech products. And what I learned is that you really need, when you run a business, you really need to observe at the micro level what are the things positive that are happening, and try to build them up, and discard what's not working. And I think we didn't do that enough.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I guess even if you look at the average and it's not so promising within that, there's often categories of interest.
Yeah, huge spikes one way or the other.
This is a shorter discussion with the previous experience story, but notice how effective it is in communicating drive, persistence, and proactiveness in the candidate. This is for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, it's the actions he describes, how he really wanted to make this happen despite having a course to do alongside it, how he then went and found his friends and got them involved, how he made a system to try and complete the website in a short space of time. On the other hand, though, it's also about the tone and style. You can really see how he's excited when he recalls these facts and what he's done, how he was quite inspired at the time and very motivated. And so it's both the content of what he's talking about and the way he's talking about it that makes this come across as a story that's very effective. Looking at this fit interview overall, it's a very strong one. I'd say this is a very strong hire based on this performance. Walking through the overall assessment sheet, I really score this candidate in the following way. When it comes to rapport building, it's definitely above the bar. He makes this conversational throughout. He shows confidence and shows poise. This works well and puts him in good stead for the interview. His performance track record is certainly also above the bar too. Here, he mentions a couple of strong characteristics about himself. From his entrepreneurship experience to his academic experience, you can see the candidate's a high performer. Third, when it comes to his motivation, I'd say the candidate's really distinctive in the top 10% of candidates. He's done a fantastic job in telling us a bit about what motivates him, what interests him, and describing the arc of his career right the way through from his studies until where he is now in a way that makes sense. Then finally, when it comes to transferable abilities, I'd say it's a distinctive performance too. Again, in the top 10% of candidates. And in particular, he displays fantastic evidence of drive and well-developed influence skills. Beyond the general scoring, there are a few comments to take away from this fit interview. First, don't feel the need to talk for too long. You'll notice that the candidate is extremely concise. He gives short summaries, either of his background or of his experience stories, which he then turns into a discussion. This is a good way to go. Better to proceed in that direction than to launch into a 3-minute story about yourself and maybe lose your interviewer. Second, notice how each of the sections connect quite neatly together. There's a very clear arc in this candidate's story. He describes everything from his academic career until now in a way where you can see consistent interests. While you don't have to do this, it makes your overall motivation much more compelling if you can do it. Lastly, notice how he's structured his experience stories. The candidate uses quite a simple structure that we've listed in the materials as well. He starts with a brief situation. He then describes a complication, what made this situation difficult or tricky to deal with at the time. Then he describes actions and invests almost all his time in describing those actions, what he did and why he did it. And then lastly, he describes some tangible and specific impact. This simple structure, with the focus very much on the actions and what you did, is a good approach to follow.
Thank you for watching till the end. If you found the video helpful, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. To watch more fit interviews like this, join our interview prep course on CaseCoach.com. In the meantime, if you'd like to get more free videos and prep material, just follow the link below to sign up to our mailing list. See you soon on CaseCoach.com.